Okay, so in this last lecture on argument, I want to say something about missing premises. Um, Sometimes you hear these called implied premises, there are other names for them, and this is a premise that the argument needs to work, but doesn't explicitly state. It just kind of assumes it. Implied or unstated premises, right? You also hear them called unstated. If you want to use the fancy Greek term, you'll hear enthymemes. We don't need to know that, but basic idea, a premise that the argument needs to work, but it doesn't explicitly state. And it's pretty common an argument will assume a premise or premises that it doesn't state. And this is important because a lot of times these premises are obvious, right? And you're going to have to leave some things out, if, I might make an argument, president's a federal employee, so Joe Biden's a federal employee, right? Going back to one of our earlier arguments. The implied premise there is, well, Biden's president, but everybody knows that, right? You don't need to say that. The problem is that sometimes with missing premises, one very tricky, underhanded thing people will do is to not explicitly say the most controversial premise, the most dubious one, right? Sometimes people do this in an underhanded way, sometimes people are just sloppy about it, but either way, when that's the case, when it's not something like Biden's president or the sky's blue, it's good to bring up the missing premises, make them explicit, because they might need a lot more scrutiny than they get. And they might just be false. We might need to reject them. All right. So that's why it's important to be able to spot missing premises, right? Well, how do we know if an argument has a missing premise? Once we figure out if it does have one, we're going to have to figure out how to fill that in. And that's another thing. But first, we need to know how we even spot arguments with missing premises. Well, one thing, remember, and this will be very important for our class, remember what Vaughan says about moral arguments, right? The conclusion is always a moral statement, and they always have at least one non-moral premise and one moral premise, right? So if an argument is a moral argument, that is, it makes a moral claim in the conclusion, and it doesn't have any moral premises, then it's obviously missing a premise, and the premise it's missing might be missing more than one, but it's missing at least one. And one premise it's missing is a moral premise, right? If a moral argument has no non-moral premises, then clearly it's missing at least one non-moral premise, right? Because it needs at least one. So here's an example. Most students will not use any mathematics beyond Algebra 1 in their future jobs. So high school students should not be required to take any classes beyond Algebra 1, right? You might not think of this as a moral argument, but it's a moral argument, right? It's saying what schools or the people in charge of schools should do. They should not make students take any classes beyond Algebra 1, right? It would be wrong for them to do that. It is wrong for them to do that, this argument says. Maybe you agree, maybe you don't. That's what the argument says. It has a moral conclusion. But we distill it, and we notice it doesn't have a moral premise, right? Most students will not use any mathematics beyond Algebra 1 in their future jobs, so high school students shouldn't be required to take any mathematics beyond Algebra 1. We have a factual statement. I mean, maybe this statement is true, maybe it's not. I tend to think it is. I've never used, well, except when I teach logic, which is more advanced than Algebra 1, but actually we didn't learn any of that stuff in high school. I use, mathematics beyond Algebra 1 almost never in my job, right? I know very few people who do. So I tend to think this is true, but, it's a factual statement. We could do some research, try to support it, whatever. But then we have we're missing a moral statement. But what is the moral statement, right? We're missing a moral premise. How should we fill it in? Now look, when I actually teach a logic class, we spend a week, or maybe 2 weeks sometimes, just on this. How to fill in premises, how to fill in missing premises. And we do that because filling in missing premises can be very hard. When we get into class, this is something we're going to practice on. We're not going to spend as much time as I would in a logic class. But we'll do a little practice because this can be very difficult. And it's difficult because there aren't any neat rules. There aren't any, oh, well, do X, Y, Z, and you know you're right about filling in missing premises. It's as much an art, if not more of an art, than a science. But there are some guidelines. You're not just kind of guessing here. Now, I think the three guidelines are this. The premise, if you're talking about deductive arguments, and we are, the premise should make the argument valid. You know, this is not a valid argument, because it could be true that students won't use any mathematics beyond Algebra 1, and we can also imagine ways that 2 is false, you know, because 1 doesn't say anything about what they should do, and, you know, premise 2 does. So the missing premise that we fill in should make the argument valid. It should make it work. The premise should be true, or at least as non-controversial as possible. And I'll talk about why that is in a second. But the premise must also respect what the person actually says. And now, that's one of the problems, is that 1 and 2 can sometimes be in tension with 3, right? Ideally, we want to satisfy all these guidelines. It might not always be possible. We'll talk about that in a second. But the reason we want to do this goes back to a principle that will be very important in this class that I'm going to bang the table on, the so-called principle of charity. And the principle of charity says to always give the other person, whether it's somebody you're reading with, somebody you're discussing with, you want to give them the best argument you can for their claim, for their conclusion, that is consistent with what they actually say. So you want to give them a good argument. You want to do the best you can to give them a sound argument. So you want to make the argument valid, because the argument needs to be valid to be sound. You also want to give them true premises or make your best effort at doing so. Now, principle of charity, I'll talk more about this. Look, you might say, well, look, why would I want to be charitable if somebody's making an argument for a moral position that I find wrong, if not even evil, right? Well, I think for 2 reasons, or 3 actually. You know, 1, if you give the other person the best argument you possibly can, if you want to be critical, if you show that even the best version of their argument doesn't work, that's really powerful. If you take some stupid version of their argument and show that that doesn't work, they can just say, that's not what I mean, you know? That's not what I mean, that proves nothing. You know, philosophers call this the Straw Man Fallacy, right? And what it means is, like, you're not actually fighting with the other person, you're just fighting with, like, a straw dummy that you say is them, right? It proves nothing, it doesn't defeat the other position. The second reason you want to give the other person the best possible argument is, look, you know, I said one reason we want to make arguments is to understand why other people think what they think. And if you give them stupid reasons for thinking it, that's probably not what their reasons are, right? If you try to give them a good case, even if you don't think the case ultimately works, you will understand other people's positions better. The third reason is this just what we owe other people, right? If you're not charitable, if you try to give the other person a stupid argument, that's treating them as though they're an idiot, right? And you might think the other person's wrong, but there's a difference between being wrong and being an idiot, right? And so treating another person like they're an idiot, like they don't have at all good reasons for what they think, you know, this itself is a moral claim, but I think that's wrong, right? We shouldn't treat other people that way. We should treat them with respect. And part of treating them with respect is to try to give them the best reasons we can find, consistent with what they actually say, for the arguments they make. So look, how would we, let's actually put a little bit of detail in this, make it a little more concrete. So here's our argument, right? Most students will not use any mathematics beyond Algebra 1 in their future jobs. So high school students shouldn't be required to take any mathematics beyond Algebra 1. Now let's look at our candidate moral principles or moral claims that would make the argument work. Many students struggle with calculus. High schools should not teach any classes that most students will not find useful in their future jobs. High school students should not be required to take classes that will not be useful for most of them in future jobs. Students should only be required to take classes that might be useful to them in their future jobs. Alright, so which of these is the best way to fill in the missing premise? Which of these is the best candidate for the missing premise? Think about this for, count to 10, then I'll give you guys the answer. Let's go through them, right? A, many students struggle with calculus. That's a non-starter here, right? Remember, the premise we are missing is a moral premise, a moral statement. This isn't a moral statement, right? It's a factual statement. Might be true, might be false. I tend to think it is true. Doesn't matter. It's not the right kind of thing to make the argument work. It also wouldn't make the argument valid, right? It could be true that most students won't use math beyond Algebra 1 and that many students find calculus hard, but that also they should be required to take this stuff, right? That could be true. Nothing that the argument says shows it's not. Well, let's look at the other three. High schools should not teach any classes that most students will not find useful in their future jobs. Well, it seems like we might have to plug a bit more, but it seems like something like that would make the argument work, right? It would make it valid, right? If most students won't find math beyond Algebra 1 useful, and we shouldn't teach any classes that most students won't find useful, then, if we're not teaching it, students can't be forced to take it, the argument would work, right? The problem is that B is way too controversial, way too strong, right? It's stronger than the argument needs to work. It's more controversial. It violates 2, and that makes it a problem, right? I mean, look. I tend to be sympathetic with this argument that maybe students shouldn't be required to take as much math as they do. But would I say that schools shouldn't teach math beyond Algebra 1? No, that's crazy, right? If a student really likes math, why shouldn't they have the opportunity to take it? If a student wants to do something with their life that requires math, be an engineer, why shouldn't math be, why should they have to wait to college? That would be crazy, right? B would make the argument work, but it's just incredibly controversial. I think B is wrong, and I'm sympathetic to the argument. So, because it's too controversial, because it's almost certainly not true, B isn't a good one either. Well, let's look at C, right? High school students should not be required to take classes that will not be useful for most of them in their future jobs. This might be a bit controversial. Not everyone's going to agree with it, right? Some people will say, well, there's some classes that make you a well-rounded person. You should have to take those. But it's much less controversial than B, right? And it would make the argument work. If, most students won't find this useful, this is saying if they don't find it useful, most won't find it useful, they shouldn't have to take it. Well, but let's look at D, right? Let's see if D is maybe even a better candidate. Students should only be required to take classes that might be useful for them in their future jobs. Well, D is too weak, right? All the argument says is most students. Well, if it's unlikely, if most students won't find it useful, that's not saying, D seems to be saying, well, if there's any possibility, if there's no possibility that you'll find it useful, then you shouldn't have to take it. Well, but the argument already admits there's some possibility students will find this useful. D is too weak to make the argument work, too weak to make it valid. Kind of think of this as a sort of Goldilocks thing. B would make the argument work, but it's so strong that most people would reject it. It's way too controversial. D might be the least controversial premise here. It's less controversial than C, but it's not strong enough to make the argument work. C is a sort of Goldilocks premise, makes the argument work, but it's not any more controversial than it needs to be. So, the government should put a special tax on sugary food, since any addictive substance should have a special tax on it. Well, let's look at, the argument when we distill it. The government should put special taxes on addictive substances, therefore the government should put a special tax on sugary food, right? Well, this argument, what kind of premise is it missing? It's missing a non-moral premise, right? Premise 1 tells us what the government should do. It's obviously a moral premise. Well, our missing premise then will have to be a non-moral premise. So here's some candidate missing premises. Sugary food is habit forming. Eating sugary food causes diabetes and heart disease. Sugar is unnatural. Sugary food is addictive. Alright, so our candidate missing premises. Sugary food is habit forming. Eating sugary food causes diabetes and heart disease. Sugar is unnatural. People who eat sugary food lack the virtue of temperance. Sugary food is addictive. Sugar is just as addictive as heroin. Let's go through these and see what we think, right? Well, again, will A make this a valid argument? No, right? The argument talks about putting special taxes on addictive substances. Well, it's not enough to say sugar is habit forming, right? Plenty of things are habit forming that none of us would say are addictive, right? If you start an exercise routine and you make a point of wanting to do it, in a sense, that's habit forming. Nobody's going to say running is addictive, right? In any real sense of that term. Eating sugary food causes diabetes and heart disease. Well, that's probably true. Doesn't make this a valid argument because, right, the argument says nothing about diabetes and heart disease. If the first premise said the government should put special taxes on things that cause diabetes and heart disease, then, B would make it a valid argument, but it doesn't, right? You have to pay attention to what the argument actually says. Sugar is unnatural. Doesn't talk about anything being unnatural, so that doesn't work either, right? And honestly, this talk about unnatural is just vague, right? I'm not even sure whether this is a moral premise or the kind of factual premise we need. D. People who eat sugary food lack the virtue of temperance. Well, A, the premises don't talk about temperance and taxes, so it wouldn't make the argument valid. B, it's not the right kind of premise, right? When we talk about people having virtues or not, we're obviously making moral claims. We're looking for a non-moral claim here, right? Sugary food is addictive. Well, that would make our argument work, right? If it's addictive, we ought to put a special tax on it. Sugary food's addictive. That would give us a valid argument. Sugar is just as addictive as heroin. Alright, so final one, sugary food is not just addictive, but it's addictive as heroin. Right? That would make the argument work, but it says more than it needs to. It's more controversial. In fact, I think this is almost certainly false. So, E and F would both make the argument valid. They satisfy number 1 here. But F is more controversial, less likely to be true. Than is its rival, so it fails too. So E is the best way to fill this in, gives the person a valid argument. It's also the most, least controversial, the one of these that has the best chance of being true. It might be true, it might not be true, but, it's way easier to, to make an argument that it is true than it is to make an argument that F's true. Now, one thing I will say is that sometimes it is just plain impossible to give the other person a good argument for what they're saying. If that's the case, then you have to respect what they actually say. Ideally, you should try to satisfy 1, 2, and 3, but if you can't, 3 takes precedence, 3 trumps the other 2. So here's an example from the Vaughan reading. The use of condoms is completely unnatural. They have been designed with the explicit purpose of interfering with the natural process of procreation. Therefore, condoms should be banned. The only way I can think of to make this argument work is to plug in the premise that Vaughan plugs in, or something like it, right? Anything, it's here in red, anything that interferes with the natural process should be banned. That's a moral premise, but it's a pretty dumb moral premise, right? Antibiotics interfere with a natural process, right? The bacteria killing you or making you very sick. High blood pressure medicines interfere with the natural process, having high blood pressure. Is it wrong to take those? Anyway, this premise is a bad one. It's almost certainly false. But it's the premise the argument needs to work. It's what the person's saying. If this is what they're saying, you can't plug in a different premise. You can't rework their argument just because it might be a better one. You have to respect what they are actually saying, even if that ends up sticking them with a bad argument. If it's up in the air, if it's, if there are different ways to interpret their argument, and one way makes it a good argument and one way makes it a bad one, you should go for the way that makes it better. But if what they're saying is just clearly a bad argument, you have to respect what the other person actually says. Alright, so I know that's a lot, but that's our sort of whirlwind tour through argument. We will touch on all this stuff going forward, though. So this is just a first pass at a lot of it. These concepts will come up again. So, if not every single thing is clear now, don't worry. We'll do a lot of practice with this, especially some of the more important concepts in the future.